Let's get comfortable with the uncomfortable. Today on the Prenup podcast with lawyer Ian Steinberg. Welcome to another episode of the Prenup podcast. Today I have my new friend Ian Steinberg here with me, who is an incredible lawyer. He actually reached out to me directly after seeing a few events that I did with Sherry Bernstein. And we went and had coffee and instantly connected. And now I'm lucky enough to have him on the pod. So, Ian, tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. This is awesome. I am a matrimonial and family law attorney. I practice here in New York City. My firm is called Berkman, Botker, Newman, and Shine, and we also have offices in Westchester and Long Island. So I do everything from prenups, you guessed it, divorce cases, mediation, negotiation, litigation, and then other family-related issues. But one of my favorite things is prenup, so I couldn't be more excited to be here.
Okay, so where did you grow up?
I grew up in Westchester.
Okay. And how did you end up in New York City?
It's the dream, right? I mean, I went to school at Emory in Atlanta, and then I knew from probably as soon as I got there that as much as I loved Atlanta, like New York was in my blood. I tell people all the time that I was a freshman and I had about 20 minutes to get to my class, and I went to get like a quick sandwich, and the person at the checkout line was so wonderful, asking me my major and how my grandmother was doing. I'd never met this person before in my life. And all I'm thinking is like, come on, come on, come on. I need to get to class. And it was the very fast-paced New York in me. And while I learned to calm down, and I think that that was a great learning experience, and being there for 4 years was amazing, but I learned very quickly that I needed to be back in the hustle and bustle. So I went to Cardozo for law school, which is here in New York City, and I haven't left since.
So how old were you when you knew you wanted to be a lawyer?
I think I was 22 because I was about to graduate college and thinking, what do I want to do? And school for 3 more years sounded awesome. And
Sign me up.
And my parents told me I was really good at arguing, for better or for worse. And so I decided I should go to law school.
Did you grow up with siblings?
I did. I have a younger sister.
And did you always win arguments with her?
Yes, but fortunately we didn't argue that much. She's the best.
Oh, that's amazing. So, okay, grew up in Westchester and neither of your parents are lawyers.
Correct.
Okay. So what did your parents do?
My dad is a dentist,
Okay.
and my mom took the best care of me and my sister that any mother could.
That's the hardest job out there.
Yes, it is.
So you didn't even grow up with lawyers in your sphere.
No, but that's what every good family needs, is a lawyer, because now I've been pulled into just about everything you can think of, even though all I do is matrimonial and family law.
But now you're like the guy that they call.
Yes, and in all fairness, I did start practicing law as a real estate attorney, and I did that for about 5 years before I made the switch to matrimonial law. So I do have other experiences.
So let's talk about that, because I actually, when we were getting to know each other, I found that to be one of the most interesting things, since the only other lawyer who I've talked to who kind of made the transition was Jackie Combs from the West Coast. But I was like, how did you started in real estate, and then where was the impetus or the inflection point of you saying, okay, I want to get it? Like, who leaves that to go into matrimonial law?
I get that question a lot. Like, what the heck was that switch? So the impetus was really COVID. So for all of the negatives that came along with COVID, I know people talk a lot about some of the silver linings. And for me, real estate law, I did a lot of real estate litigation. I also did closings and leasings, and a lot of that just stopped, especially in March of 2020, when no one knew what the world was going to look like. Courts were pretty much closed, and a lot of transactions weren't taking place. And I had sort of this moment where I could think, and I sort of thought, like, is this what I see myself doing for the next 40 years? And the answer resoundingly was no. And then I started to think, okay, like, what don't I like about my current field of law, and what is something that I'm looking for? And I really found the real estate world, to, at least for me, where I was, to be very repetitive, to be a little monotonous. And I felt like I was doing the same thing over and over again. And I didn't have a personal connection to my clients. I was representing big pieces of steel throughout New York City. And while, yes, there were landlords that I would work with and, sometimes tenants, and it was nice when people closed on their homes, it wasn't the same personal connection. And so I was looking for an area of the law where I could really feel like I was helping people, connecting with people, and then also having something very different from case to case, from day to day, from even hour to hour. And that is what I have in my day to day life now. Sometimes I joke that maybe I swung the pendulum a little too far in the other direction, and now I get really deep into people's personal lives. But I really like that. I find myself to be a people person, and I feel like I could really help people, and that's what I was looking for.
I've talked to so many couples this last year who have either gotten a prenup or gone through a divorce. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that the people that have had the best experience with their lawyers, it's not just having a lawyer, right? It's having someone that you can call with like a variety of questions who actually understands you, believes in you, and is fighting for you, right? Whether it is just negotiating a prenup or it is going through a divorce and trying to figure out what the best settlement and outcome is for a couple. And so how do you, because from the little I've known about you so far, you are a really personable person. Like you are very easy to talk to and engage with. How do you set boundaries where it's like, okay, I'm going to be your friend, but also I'm your lawyer?
Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying that. That's very kind. It's hard. It's hard because you are there for someone and they are relying on you. And a lot of times now we're our clients' first call, at least in this time period when something is going wrong. And I think it's important for us as the lawyers to make sure that we are focused on the legal strategy on what is best for your case, whether that's, a divorce case or a prenup. And while we are compassionate people and we understand the intense emotion that comes along with whether it's a prenup or a divorce, but it's our job to sort of take the emotion and put it to the side. It doesn't mean that we ignore the emotion by any stretch, but I do think that it's about focusing on the legal element of it because that's what we're here for. And so to separate those two, it helps us if people have the emotions in check or that they're using the right professionals to help them with that. It helps sort of see the legal strategy clearer and say, okay, I want to keep the house because it's where I've raised my kids, but financially it doesn't necessarily make sense. Or can I leverage this to get something else? And if you have those emotions properly handled and managed, and that's not to say that we can't assist with that, but there are some amazing professionals who do work at that as well. I think that's where the line is, but I still want my clients to feel like I'm always fighting for them, I'm on their team, and that I can be the first call if they need
I was
something.
joking with someone the other day where I was like, we should set up a service where it's if you go and get divorced, you get a lawyer, you get a therapist, and you get a personal trainer. All three to keep all the parts of you together in the chaos.
And that's what it is. It's a team approach, right? Whether it's the three professionals that you just mentioned, or an accountant, or a financial advisor, or a real estate broker, whatever it is, for someone going through a divorce to get to the other side in the best possible way they can, they need a whole team that's all pushing in the right direction.
Okay. So divorce, marriage, all the things, prenups. Let's get into this. So you said that you've seen an uptick in inbounds for prenups in the past year or two, right?
Yes.
What do you think is kind of shifting that move?
I think it's become less taboo. Like I think it used to be this thing where a family has money and they say no matter what, there's going to be a prenup and it doesn't matter who you marry. They may be the most unbelievable person in the world, but this is what our family is going to do. And while that is still an instance that we see quite often, I think there are couples who just want more information on how things will work in the event of a divorce. And how else would you know that unless you've either been divorced or you're going through the prenup process? Um, and I think perhaps maybe that a lot more couples are dual income. Both future spouses are working and maybe will remain working throughout the marriage. They sort of can set up their financial independence and figure out how they're going to structure their financial life instead of leaving the state that they live in to determine what their financial arrangement will be.
I'm laughing. I'm thinking back. The funniest story I've had so far this year from a lawyer was literally a clause in a prenup for an iguana.
Hmm, that's fun.
Didn't even know that that was a thing. But what are some of the interesting things that you've kind of seen in the past few years that people have either been asking for in their prenups or that you have suggested, said, maybe this is something we should be looking into?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the first question I always ask people is, how do you want your income to be treated? Because at least here in New York, under the law, it's considered marital income that you earn during the marriage. If you want to switch that, meaning anything in your name that you earn is yours and your future spouse's is his or hers, you have to do that by prenup. So that's always my first question. And then things get a little interesting based on which of those paths that you want to choose. But, in terms of crazy clauses, people always ask about the infidelity clause, about the cheating clause. It's not something that I usually advise. I don't know how you prove cheating. I don't know how you define cheating. I don't know what the financial penalty is for cheating, if that is what it is supposed to be or what you're looking for. But it is probably the question that I get most in terms of interesting clauses that people want to include. I haven't really had so much about the pets, but that's certainly coming up more and more as people get more and more tied to their pets, and the law actually develops more and more about pets. But I think the cheating clause is really the number one that I get.
And it's interesting to your point, right? It's like, what do you define as cheating, right? What does the law define as cheating? Because in this age, 2025, cell phones, texting, sexting, all these pieces, it's like the laws weren't necessarily put in place when any of this access to others existed, right?
Right. And I mean, New York is a no fault divorce state. The court doesn't particularly care at this point why you're getting divorced. And if you're sitting in the courthouse, presumably 50 or more percent of the people there are sitting there because there was infidelity.
Yeah.
So, and yes, to your point, it's okay. Is there an emotional relationship? Does that count? Is there just texting? Does there have to be sex? Is it something less than that? Like, how do you decide that? And then how do you define that? And do you really want to be describing and defining that in an agreement? And if so, like, what is the quote unquote penalty for that? And so I think that's where things get super interesting.
Do you ever have couples come in and they kind of start going through this all and conversations like this arise and then they realize we are not meant to be together. This prenup has actually made us reflect and have a moment and say, "Oh my gosh, this is not like we are not on the same page."
Fortunately, I've only had that happen once. I think that part of what I tell couples all the time is you're about to get married. So while yes, this is a negotiation, and yes, if I'm representing you, I have your best interests in mind 100%, but you are about to get married. So let's try and do this as collaboratively as possible and in a way in which you're not standing on the altar saying, what the heck just happened over the last couple of months we were negotiating. But I think part of the benefits of doing a prenup is that you are having hard financial conversations prior to getting married that some people just simply never have. And that could be a reason why people get divorced down the road because they weren't on the same financial page. And so, yes, that may be terrible if they're about to get married and then ultimately they realize through the process that this isn't the right fit from a couple standpoint. That's likely better than getting married, going down that path and realizing later on, oh my God, why did I do this? Because divorce is expensive, emotionally and financially. Yeah.
So, okay. So you said the other thing that we talked about a few weeks ago was that like there is something to be said about I'm hoping, right? That once you get a prenup, you have all these financial conversations, you get to know each other a little bit better. You're kind of setting yourself up for a more successful marriage, right? Because you're laying it all out there. When you now on the flip side, right, with all your experience with divorces, what is the number one reason that you see people coming to you for a divorce?
It's an
Or the
interesting
or
question.
the top like 2 or 3?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think sometimes people just grow apart. I think that people have kids and their lives sort of they separate as a couple as opposed to kind of coming more together, which
Mhm.
is obviously much easier to do prior to having children. Um, I think infidelity is a big one too. And then I think arguments about financial issues, whether that's someone was spending too much or someone wasn't saving or they just had different ideas on how they were going to treat their financial lives. Someone wanted to just keep buying more and more. houses and someone else didn't want to do that, or other sort of financial reasons. But I actually think the top is probably just people growing apart and recognizing.
Yeah.
I know that's not the sexy answer, but
No, but it's
it's
life,
it.
right?
Mm.
Especially in these days where people are living longer, people are in different communities, and people both usually have careers within their relationship. There's not as much time to grow together, and oftentimes people do grow apart.
And I think you see that a lot. There's disagreements on kid-related issues, but it's not like they're fighting with each other. It's
Yeah.
not there's abuse. It's not like there's infidelity. Of course, those things do unfortunately happen,
Yeah.
but I think the most common thing is just to your point, you just don't have time to sort of devote to your relationship.
So with prenups, I know that you can't put a lot of clauses in there, but are there conversations that come up that you find interesting when it comes to, like, if one person has to give up their career and or take a break or take a step back, like, what does that look like?
I mean, I think one of the hardest things about prenups is that you're sort of predicting or attempting to predict the future while sitting here at a time in which a lot of times both parties are working, things are all great, you're super happy, you're about to get married. What is it going to look like down the road? And especially from an income standpoint, is someone's income going to increase significantly? Is someone's income going to reduce, whether that's for just natural reasons based on their job and their career, or are they to a point going to stay home and take care of kids? So, one of the ways that we do that is with a spousal support provision or alimony. I have many times added clauses in which it says if one spouse stops working, then they would be entitled to seek alimony from the other spouse, which likely is how it would work under the law anyway. But this is just kind of codifying that a little bit more. We've even put in how many hours are you working per week and how does that look in terms of if you're working 10 hours a week, maybe that's significant enough to really reduce your income so that you should be entitled to alimony and it's not a complete stoppage of work to take care of kids. Sometimes we include clauses for spousal support or alimony if there are children and it's waived if there's not. So it's one of the areas where there's a lot of
Yeah.
flexibility. We also sometimes do things called distributive awards, so a lump sum payment from one spouse to the other in the event of a divorce. And sometimes that's also conditioned on whether or not there's children, with the idea being that if there are children, perhaps one spouse is stopping working to take care of the kids. We also do housing provisions where perhaps one spouse will pay for the housing of the other, typically the more moneyed to the less moneyed
Yeah.
until the kids reach a certain age, whether that's the
Yeah.
youngest graduates high school or X amount of years after after a divorce. So there are some ways to sort of get creative. And so a lot of the initial conversations are, what do you see your future looking like? Which is
Yeah.
obviously a very hard question to be asking to someone who's about to get married and maybe not looking 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And unfortunately, our position is we have to live in your worst case scenario. And people often say, "Oh, that's never going to happen to me." And I said, "I hope you're right. I hope you sign this agreement, you put it in a drawer, and you never see it again. But in the event that you don't, this is what we're here for."
I think it is the other thing that's so interesting. I keep getting this, right? Even a year later, it's, oh, I don't want to prenup because I'm planning for my divorce. And it's like, if over 50% of couples are getting divorced, you're just protecting yourself. You're not planning for a divorce.
It's true, and it's the same as any other insurance policy, I think. You don't plan to get into a car accident, but you still get car insurance. You don't
Yeah.
plan for your home to have a leak or have a fire or anything like that, but you still get homeowners or renters insurance.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a similar concept, though you really it's there's an educational aspect to it, and there's an aspect of the two of you having these discussions, like we said before, that you wouldn't otherwise have. And I get the similar statements from people too about, I don't want to think about what it would look like upon a divorce now. And I get that too. Like it's a tough thing to look at. So I say, you just look at it from an educational standpoint and let the lawyers think about what happens in the worst case scenario.
So, okay, second marriages.
That's certainly an instance in which people will have prenups. I think it's very interesting. I ran into something recently where my client had child support obligations. So how does that factor in? Because if in the second
Yeah.
marriage everything's going to be considered marital, but then my client was paying paying child support. Really, my client was taking money out of the marital pot from the
Mhm.
second marriage as it relates to paying a debt from his first marriage. So that's an interesting sort of situation
How do you
that occurs.
navigate something like that from a legal perspective? Like, what is the
I mean, you're sort of saying that while this is a separate debt, it's going to be something that may be paid from marital assets
yeah.
and a credit won't be sought for it. I would imagine that people who are getting into the second marriage where there are kids from the first recognize that there are obligations to those first children from both a time standpoint and a financial standpoint. And they typically go into it recognizing and understanding that there will be commitments to that. And so that's just part of what you're signing up for.
Oh man, what's so interesting too, because I recently met someone who has been married 4 times. I'm desperately trying to get him on the podcast because it's all very fascinating. But truly, right, it is essentially every time you get into a new marriage, you're getting into a new contract of business, like in a way, like a business, right? Every time you're signing a new agreement. How do you How do you advise clients to kind of look holistically at a picture if somebody is coming in with, technically speaking, like family debt from their first marriage?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, yes, it is separate and individual contract each time, but a lot of what we're doing is saying, okay, what do you have leading up to the marriage, right? Because that's what we want oftentimes from an asset standpoint to keep separate. But from a liability standpoint, that's usually separate too. But if there's no other way to make these payments, then the income that you're considering marital, well, it's going to have to be used and it's going to have to be accounted for. So
Yeah.
is that accounted for as, okay, it's a debt that the other person may be entitled to credit for, or is it just this is what it is? But in general, we're sort of looking what's the picture before the marriage so we can take a snapshot and keep that as the separate element, and then everything can be considered marital if that's what the couple chooses to do.
So you first were in real estate law, you've transitioned into marital law. From like a long-term relationship with clients, right? How do you post prenup kind of stay in touch with them, engage with them, check in on them? Because I do think one of the things that I'm seeing and what I really want to promote going forward is like people should have a family lawyer, right? Usually, historically, unless you came from generational wealth, you didn't have a family lawyer. There was no one who kind of was in the hopper with you. But I do think there's something to be said about there's such a new generation of wealth. There's a new generation of people needing legal help more often than not. Trusts, wills, all this, prenups, postnups, everything, right? Like how do you kind of see yourself evolving beyond just divorce and prenups and or building a community where you can refer your clients to people within your network and be like, "Hey, I can't do this for you, but this person can."
It's interesting. I had a client say to me at a signing for a prenup a short while ago, so this is one of the only times where we finish a deal and I say, I hope I never have to see you again. And to a degree, I hope that that's the case, right? We don't want, like, you have the agreement, like I said, put it in the drawer, you don't see it again. And so it's interesting that a lot of times when we hear back from clients is either they have a question about the agreement. To your point, they need another professional and they've been happy with the work that we did and trust us as one of their trusted advisors to refer them to another one of our trusted advisors, or if they need a divorce again. I mean, it's raising an interesting question in my head. It's like, oh, should I reach out to every prenup client on their anniversary and wish them a happy anniversary? Like that
Yeah.
seems like it may be a nice touch. But to a degree, it's a little like, hey, hope your marriage is going great. Your divorce lawyer is here, like in case you need me, like that feels a little uncomfortable
I
too.
know.
So, I think it's hard. It's hard to develop that community. My hope is that based on the work that we've done and the relationship that we formed, that if they have friends or colleagues or family members that may need help, they would send them our way,
Yeah.
but also that if they have any questions or they do need other professionals, they would trust our recommendation.
One thing that I've started to explore more, which I really hadn't until recently, is prenup provisions down the road, right? Because I mean, it technically is as you grow or you grow apart, things change, right? As you get more money, as you maybe lose money as certain life things happen. I know our networks are a lot of founders and people that are building businesses and oftentimes coming into new levels of wealth, whether that's through investments or selling stock or equity or whatever it might be, and thinking about like, okay, when we got married, X was true, but now, 5, 10 years down the road, Y is true. Have you had anybody kind of reach out to you for provisions and or like what are your thoughts around prenup provisions down the road?
So a lot of when people reach out for that, it's really for a postnup.
Yeah.
So it's okay, our circumstances have changed. What do we do now to sort of put things in place that in the event things went wrong, we wouldn't be fighting over the value of the business or the value of the shares or whatever the case may
Yeah.
be. And we see it a lot with founders who are starting businesses and saying, okay, now that I've started this, I think it's going to be a huge hit. And what do I do, right? Do I
Yeah.
want to be fighting in the event of a divorce about what percentage of the business my spouse may be entitled to and other sort of related issues? And it's a great opportunity to then reach out and say, okay, this is our new current set of circumstances. Is there some way that you can help us mitigate any issues down the road, or in the event we do get divorced, not have it be a long drawn out fight because we have at least some things that are set. Um, I will say some of the leverage is lost once you've gotten married, and that's not to say that people should be leveraging marriage with the prenup. We like to be a collaborative process, like I said before. But if you're the spouse and your spouse started a business, does it make sense for you to say, "Oh no, now I'm okay with you keeping some of it to yourself"?
Yeah.
Perhaps it does because you're still, it doesn't mean that you need to be cut out. It just means that things could be predetermined based on percentages or other things like that, that in the event things go south, you have made this to be an easier process from a divorce standpoint. But sometimes that's an uncomfortable conversation too, that people are like, no, I'm just not having that.
Yeah. Interesting. It is so funny how so much of it is just about getting comfortable with uncomfortable things. Like, how do you how do you prepare for the worst when you're in like hopefully the best time of your life? And it is such a weird balance of the two. I can't I always wish I had like a better answer. Someone recently, a woman who came to one of our events, so she's moved in with someone. They bought an apartment together. They're not married yet. And she's trying to understand her finances with her partner. And the partner said, and I quote, I don't want to talk about our finances because, like, with our home, because our home's our happy place together. I was like, oh my God, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard. But I also get it. But it's also just, it's the happiest place for you until it's not.
And my first thing that went off in my head when you said they bought a home together, I'm like, okay, we need to have some provisions about what happens with that home. What's the ownership? Did someone put some of their, how much money did they each contribute to this? What would happen in the event of a divorce as to who would stay, who would go? Are they selling it? Can someone buy the other one out? And these are all the things that are spinning in my head when you say that. And I recognize, to your point, like, yes, that is like a happy place and hell, it's not.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't really matter whether it's a happy place or not. It's an investment. This, to a degree, there's a business element to the marriage, and if that's how they're gonna move forward, they should have these types of conversations.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay. So from that perspective, right? So technically it's not a prenup. You're going into a contract with a partner that you're not yet married to, but like you are putting in energy, effort into making the home a home. You might be the one who's like GCing the entire situation. You maybe put 5% of the 25% down payment, or maybe you technically haven't put anything down into it to begin with, but going forward, like you pay the bills, you contribute in some way, shape, or form. Would you ever be like, how would you be someone that someone could reach out to and be like, hey, I need a structure, an agreement. We're technically not getting married, but we've just entered into living together. Like, how do we how do we bind ourselves contractually in a smart way in case we have to break up, but it's not technically a marriage, so it's not technically a divorce?
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that because there have been a lot of different types of agreements that have sort of sprung out of the prenup world because of just the different nature of people's relationships.
Mhm.
And it's maybe not as black and white where there people are getting married and to your point, they have other living arrangements,
Yeah.
other relationship type arrangements. We have done a lot of cohabitation agreements, which I think is exactly what you're talking about, which is this is how we're going to pay the bills. This is who gets a credit for this. This is what happens in the event of if we break up, does someone get the right to buy the other one out? There's a lot of like provisions that we almost pluck from the prenup and
Yeah.
we use it towards something else. We've also done embryo agreements recently,
Oh,
which is super interesting now
I
that
wanna hear
that's
more about
becoming,
that.
yeah. So basically, the one I did somewhat recently was just they're not married. They are hoping to get married in the future. They are a bit older, so they are freezing their embryos. So they are going to store them at a particular facility. And the agreement was about who's paying for the storage. What happens if they get, if they ultimately break up?
Yeah.
What happens if they get married and then they break up? What happens if they're not married and they break up? What happens if one of them were to pass away? What does it look like for other rights for other people, whether that's grandparents or siblings or things like that?
Mhm.
Who's responsible for support obligations and things like that? So it's a very interesting new type of agreement, and there's a whole body of law around these issues. And I think it's sort of formulating a bit more, but it's a very interesting, again, it's not necessarily a prenup yet, and this couple may, if they get married, actually do a prenup too. And we oftentimes attach the embryo agreement if people have done it to a prenup, saying, this is another agreement that they've signed, and this will be valid and binding, and it's attached as an exhibit here, so that it really gives an extra layer of like reinforcement or ratification of the embryo agreement. But it's a whole kind of thing that didn't exist before, and I think it's really smart for people to do it in advance.
It's so one of the things that I keep getting when I'm hosting events or hosting panels is, prenups are taboo. And I was like, yeah, so was freezing your eggs like 5 years ago. And
Mhm.
now it's like, oh, when are you doing it? You haven't done it? Oh my God, what? And to that point, right, of like the eggs versus embryos, I think what's so interesting is I froze my eggs a few years ago. And I remember in my gut, I had this moment of like, the doctor had said embryos are more viable. And at the time I was with a partner, and I remember being like, I just want the option in case something happens. And I didn't even think about the legal piece of it, right?
Yeah.
And recently I had a friend who was going through a divorce and she did multiple rounds of IVF with her partner, didn't work, and they still have some embryos left. And it's like, what do you do with those? And now that they're going through a divorce, it's become an entire mess of a conversation, right? Like disagreements on, what should happen to them. But it's interesting because to that point, they didn't talk about it before.
Yeah, and there are particular agreements that the storage facility or the medical facility where these types of things are done do have, but this is sort of another layer of here's what we want to happen. Here's what, will happen in all of these different circumstances.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting new development of things that really have not been issues in the past. So let's again prepare for what may happen upon the worst case scenario and
So
think about
smart. How okay, because it is such kind of a new thing, like how do these types of laws come about and like get put into practice, I would say.
I mean, I think it's a nature sort of what the needs are
Yeah.
and people seeing how things work. I mean, even in the pet context, there have been a lot more pet laws that have come out recently. New York has sort of codified that a companion animal is sort of part of the equitable distribution. It's interesting they've put it in the property division section as opposed to the custody section. And it also sort of the issue with that to a degree is you're sort of looking at the best interests of the pet, but that's really the custody standard.
Yeah.
And then if you have unmarried people who would otherwise be in the family court for custody issues, because it's not codified in the Family Court Act, which doesn't deal with dividing up of people's property, because that's only if you're married. There aren't pet-related issues that can really be handled in the family court, despite it being a similar family issue. And so now married people with pets are treated differently than unmarried people with pets. So I know I'm veering from the embryo to another
No, it's
interesting issue
interesting,
that
but it is all right. It is all like ownership of or ownership. I don't know if that's the right word, but like it is discussion over an item and or something that could be life and or is life. Like it's just it's fascinating. It's something that I really
yeah.
I'm fascinated by now that we're talking about this.
No, it's very interesting, and I think a lot of it comes from just these issues coming up in real life, and then judges having to sort of rule on the issue, and then
But that's also new for them too. They're like,
and they don't really have a
"Ah."
basis for the law, because if the legislature hasn't set out, here's what the law is, you're sort of shooting from the hip a little bit to figure out this dispute. And if the dog is what's holding up some of the, the divorce getting finalized, the judge is going to want to find a way to get that settled and get that finalized. I know there are people who now are specializing in pet mediation. An email was just circulating around our office about that because someone's having a pet related issue. So all of these sort of niche specialty areas are coming up because the issues are coming up and people need ways to resolve it.
Oh my gosh. It's all so valid. Like it really is. And it's crazy just to think how, when emotions get in the way, uh, you're it's so easy to not see straight or think straight. And so it's like a good thing to have kind of a base to work from.
Yeah, and I think that's what happens a lot, and it goes back to what I said before with the emotions and having them in check. If they're not, that's where things sometimes can get out of whack and can get more contentious than they maybe need to be. And that's not saying that there's something wrong with having the emotions. It would be odd if you didn't have these strong emotions around all of these very difficult and personal issues. But things like pets and embryos are more offshoots that now we are surprising that we have to deal with, but also not surprising.
Yeah. What are some other things that you've seen kind of come up that are like more on the, I would say, forefront of just with like the change of society and or um uh, it being 2025? Like, are there any other interesting things that you've kind of seen come on the front end for prenups and or negotiations between couples?
I mean, I think we've sort of hit on like the three biggest
Yeah.
ones, which really are the pets, the embryos, and there definitely was a third, so blanking on it. But I think those are really the main ones.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I can't really think of other ones that have come up. I'm sure they have, and I'm sure they will. But those are really some of the more interesting and like evolving issues that have come up lately.
The only other thing that I'm kind of thinking of just based on, us being in New York and certain groups, et cetera, of clients is inheritance. So, and or trust, right? Because I do think I've talked to a few people who've been like, "Oh, I thought because XYZ was in a trust that my partner couldn't touch it." And then it's like, "No, just kidding, because we touched that trust and it's now we use some of that trust money to buy an apartment or pay for our child's school care." Like what, how do you balance some people thinking, I guess the president of law, right? If it's defined in XYZ trust as this, why is it looked at differently maybe and or not necessarily held up in court?
So in New York specifically, we sort of classify assets as either marital property or separate property. And anything that you inherit is considered separate property. So if one of your parents pass and they leave you a certain sum of money, that is your separate property from when you receive it. The question then becomes, what do you do with it to a degree? So, are you putting it into a joint bank account and are you spending it on the kids' tuition or groceries? Because that's the case, you're likely not seeing it back.
Yeah.
Are you putting it in an investment account? You're giving it to an investment advisor who's managing it. You're having no active involvement in it, and it's an account in just your name. Well, now you've kept it separate, and so that inheritance will stay separate property. There's a little bit of an in between where maybe you put it in a brokerage account and you start trading it yourself. And now you've actively appreciated it. And so now the initial amount is separate, but the appreciation could be considered marital property and likely would. And so that's where you start to have a lot of disagreements and sort of lines being blurred and grayed a bit because of the way that people treat the money once they get it. From a trust perspective, it's a little bit different. Anything in a trust is technically outside of the marital pot. It's not the
Okay.
asset of the spouse, it's the asset of the trust. Where things start to get more interesting is when those assets are distributed to a party, whether that's to a spouse, whether that's regular and recurring distributions every year, or whether that is, an amount of a large sum when they reach a certain age,
Yeah.
for example. And then sort of similarly, the same things sort of hold true, because something from a distribution from a trust is sort of a gift from a third party, the third party
Yeah.
being the trust, to one of the spouses, which is considered separate property. And so then it kind of follows the same. What are you doing with it once you've received it? And then to add a whole nother layer is, how does this impact the income, right? If you're receiving regular and recurring distributions from a trust, that likely will be imputed to you as income, which will then affect child support. It'll affect spousal support or alimony. So it's just not so cut and dry. From a prenup context, I think a lot of people like to just be very clear that anything from this trust is going to be separate. Maybe any distributions won't count for the purposes of spousal support. We can't obviously talk about anything child related,
Hmm.
no child support, no custody in prenups, but that's sort of how those get involved. But yeah, I mean, from a baseline standpoint, trust distributions are going to be separate.
So moral of the story is get a really good financial advisor and get a really good trust and estates lawyer on your team.
I think that's right. And that goes back to the team approach before.
Yes.
You need all of these professionals to do kind of the right thing and to be pulling in the same direction to make sure that you are getting the best result, and that you're really careful about, if you want this to be separate, well, don't put it in a joint bank account and start spending it on groceries. Keep it in a separate account, or at least understand that if you're going to do that, because that's how you're going to fund your lifestyle, you're likely not going to receive a credit back for it, unless you're putting it into something like a house and you can show this came from the trust right into my account and then right to the down payment of a house. And then you can get a credit back for it, because that equity likely isn't going away. When you sell it, you're going to recoup that amount. And so you can then keep that separate. But as you can see, and sorry for getting so
No, this
technical,
is amazing.
but there's like a lot of different interactions and ways in which things that could be black and white become gray very, very quickly.
To this whole point, right? Like, do you ever, when you're going and representing clients, you look at it and you're just like, we are making this so much more complicated than it needs to be. And like, we are just spinning this into a long journey for everyone involved.
I think sometimes the complications are unavoidable, but my general goal is to simplify things where we can. Instead of saying that you need this from this account and this from that account and that from that account, look, money's fungible, right? If it's easier to say 50,000 from here instead of 20 and 10 and 10 and 5 and 5, like, let's just do it the simple way. Sometimes I think of like what I was told in college, which was the KISS method, which is the keep it simple, stupid. So I think like sometimes that comes into play and people get very overcomplicated with
Simple,
things.
stupid. I
When
love that.
it's a good one. And I keep it in the back of my head sometimes when I'm reading agreements and I'm like, oh my God, like what are we doing here? And it's easy to get lost in the weeds. And then sometimes it's actually easier. And oftentimes I have someone else just do a one over on my agreements before they go out, whether it's to the client or to the other attorney, because I want someone to look it over and say, wait, like what are you like, why are you doing it this way?
Yeah.
And sometimes you get so caught up in it that it's easy for that to happen. So an extra eyes is always good to help with that.
And I feel like that's something we need to also think about with prenups is keep it simple, stupid.
Yep.
Because to your point, I sometimes think that people get so paranoid and so scared. They're like, well, if we're gonna do this, then we're gonna go over every single little detail. And it's like, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
And I think it's important to know what all the options are and figure out whether or not those are worth including or worth fighting over, or are we putting things on the table to be able to take them off? And there is the negotiation element to it. But again, like You're about to get married. So I think it's important to make sure that your interests are fully protected and the clauses that you want in the agreement are there. But at the end of the day, these agreements aren't always fair.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're not supposed to be because someone's looking to protect something. And that's why the agreement is being entered into. And it took me a little bit when I started practicing in this field to realize, like, okay, like these are not always going to be fair. But the standard, at least in New York, is unconscionability often. So it's so unfair is the standard, not a little bit unfair, like so unfair. And so coming to the realization that that is just the way it may be sometimes is helpful to people understanding that they do want to get married and they
Mhm.
want to have a nice life. And sometimes the circumstances of their spouse will afford them to have that life, and
Yeah.
that just may not be the case upon a divorce. And unfortunately, sometimes that's just the way it is. Obviously, we fight to get as much as we can without really fighting because we
Yeah.
don't want there to be fighting on the eve of a wedding.
It's a negotiation, not a litigation when you're doing a prenup.
That's right.
I always say that to my friends. I'm like, this is your time to like sit down and have these conversations when you aren't locked into something. Like if you are going to go get locked into something, make sure you lock in feeling comfortable.
Right. If you're going to give up something, at least know what you're giving up. And I
Yeah.
think that's a lot of what we like to do at our firm is just make sure that people are looking at a 40-page complicated legal document and that they understand what this means and what they're giving into, what they're agreeing to, what they're giving up, what they're not giving up.
Yeah.
And so we like to go through and put comments throughout the entire agreement that really just explain some of the legalese in English, for lack of a better way of
Mhm.
phrasing it, putting in other options, explaining things, saying this is how this was done. Do you want to do it this way? Do you want to do it that way? Here's what the language would look like. Because there's no reason why people would otherwise have seen a 40-page legal document. It's very scary sometimes. And, for us, it's, oh, yeah, of course, this is the standard language that we always
Yeah.
include, but that's not standard to the people reading it, to the couple. So that's part of our job, I think, is to really explain and make people feel comfortable, to your point.
I have a really wonderful, educated, successful friend who great husband, they're great. And what's so interesting to that point is they went to get a prenup. They got pretty far. They got the first draft and it was 90 pages or something. And I remember she was just like, you know what? No, like I don't want to read it. I don't want to deal with this. I don't understand like how this is going to take me so long. And what was interesting is she and her partner decided not to go through with it, even though they'd gone like through the initial process. But when she got the draft back, she was just like, I I can't deal.
Yeah, and a lot of people have that reaction, which is why we are trying to send it in the most palatable way, recognizing that, like, look, this is a long and scary document for someone who's never seen it before, and think, oh, let's get a prenup, and it's a couple pages and this and that, and like, that's not what it is if it's done properly and done correctly. And so to find a way to make this
Yeah.
digestible is what we would like to do and explain it and give the opportunity to say, okay, ask me whatever questions you have. And sometimes people don't know what the questions are. So we want to point out to them, here's something that they did that maybe is standard, but it doesn't track what the law would say. Or
Yeah.
they drafted it saying X and we wanted, there's an option to say, why do you want to take that option? And
I
that's
will say the only thing scarier probably than a 90-page prenup is like a 9,000-page divorce document.
I think that's
So
right.
that's yeah, man. It is funny too when you think about it. Like this morning I was having coffee with someone and we were laughing how it's like, oh yeah, I'll spend 250 to $500,000 on a wedding. Like won't even bat an eye because obviously that's what we're gonna spend. And then they're like $10,000 to $25,000 retainer for a prenup. Ooh. It's like, guys, come on.
Again, it's the same as this insurance policy thing. Like no one likes to pay the insurance premiums. No one wants to do that. But in the event something happens,
Yeah.
you're really happy that you did. And so it's hard to see the off chance of something happening and
Yeah.
thinking, oh God, like I wish I had done that. And it would have only cost me 5,000, 7,500, 10,000, whatever the case may
Yeah.
be, to hopefully save a whole lot more when it comes to litigation if there's the event of a divorce. So to your point, yeah, it's a little bit of like a sticker shock. But
Yeah.
when you compare it to a really expensive wedding, it really should pale in comparison. It's like a few extra flowers.
Someone else told me recently, they were like, the day someone gets engaged, they should just start like a prenup insurance payment, right? Which is, if you think about it, like, you put $500 per month till you get married into an account that's like, this is going to go towards our prenup,
That is really smart.
right?
I like that idea.
Right? Because he was like, think about it like this. He goes, every month, what your insurance on your car is like $200-$300, or the payment on your car, and it disappears. It's an automatic payment. Like, you don't even think about it, or you get the text message and you're like, oh, great, it's charging me again. But you don't. It's just gone, and it's coming every month. And he was like, what if we just did that from the day you get engaged? It's an automatic payment into an account that pays for your legal fees. And I was like, that is actually so great, and maybe we'll be able to find a way to do that.
I think that would be a lot more palatable for
Yeah.
people.
Totally. This was one of the most fun conversations I've had, and I can't wait to now go down a rabbit hole about embryos and all these other topics at hand. We're probably gonna have to do like a second deep dive in the new year on this.
This was so much fun, so I'm happy to come back as often as you'll have
I
me.
know, you're also a neighbor, so you can just come and hang out, and we can
Exactly
talk
right.
about all things prenups.
The commute was great.
Okay, this was wonderful. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you so
Especially
much
on
for
this
having me.
interesting day. If you guys could see, it's like the first real winter day, and he trekked over. So I'm really,
An umbrella would have
Great.
been a smart idea.
I'll send you home with one.
You're
This
the
was
best.
great.
Thanks for
Oh,
having me.
thank you for coming over.
Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
I'm so happy we did this.